I'm delighted to welcome everybody to today's Holocaust Living History Workshop featuring Jeffrey Kopstein. Please let us know where you're joining from. As always, I would like to express my gratitude to the UC San Diego Library and the Jewish Studies program for supporting the Holocaust Workshop. A heartfelt thank you also to Lou and Estelle Dunst. Lou Dunst was a much-loved Holocaust survivor from Czechoslovakia. For years, he and his wife Estelle were present at many of our events. Upon her husband's passing, Estelle set up the annual Lou Dunst Memorial Lecture in his memory. We remember them and miss them both. Today, we are honored to host Professor Jeffrey Kopstein, the Dean's Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. In his research, Professor Kopstein focuses on interethnic violence, voting patterns of minority groups, anti-Semitism. He actually just told me he just published another article on anti-Semitism, and anti-liberal tendencies in civil society. These interests are central topics in his latest books: Intimate Violence, Anti-Jewish Pogroms on the Eve of the Holocaust, Cornell University Press 2018, Politics, Memory, Violence, The New Social Science of the Holocaust, also published by Cornell 2023, and the topic of today's talk. And finally, The Assault on the State, How the Global Attack on Modern Government Endangers Our Future, published by Polity 2024. Professor Kopstein has held fellowships at Harvard University, Princeton University, Hebrew University, and the Science Center of Berlin. His expertise is certainly appreciated far and wide. Very recently, as I was reading the prominent German weekly Der Spiegel, as I am wont to do, I was both surprised and delighted when coming across an interview with him. Given his expertise, the subject matter was rather grim, as you may imagine. Professor Kopstein's talk will be followed by about 10-15 minutes of Q&A. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will keep track of them. And now please help me from your home to welcome Jeffrey Kopstein.
Susanna, thank you so much. It's a great honor to be invited to give the Lou Dunst lecture. This kind of thing is, I mean, you might know this, there's no greater honor than you can be given as a professor than simply to be invited to talk about your research. And that's what I'm going to do today. It seems to be a bit of a dry title, but you'll see in a minute, I don't think it is. The New Social Science of the Holocaust. What is it? Well, so much, I wanted to start with a couple of observations. So much of modern social science has really been about the Holocaust, even when the connections are implicit. That is, it's about the Holocaust even when social scientists don't talk about the Holocaust. And social scientists actually came very late to this. Just to give you some idea how late, the first panel ever organized on the Holocaust at the American Political Science Association, which takes place every year, usually in Washington, D.C., but also it's taken place in Los Angeles, with about 7,000 political scientists in attendance. The first ever panel on the Holocaust, that is a group of scholars together in front of an audience, took place in 2011. And I know that because I organized it. And this is an odd thing because the Holocaust is sort of the index case for mass violence in history. Many concepts used in the social sciences, genocide, human rights, our immigration regime, which is much in the newspaper right now, have come about as a result of an attempt to understand the Holocaust and to prevent anything like it from ever happening again. As some of us might know, the word genocide itself didn't exist until 1944, and it was created by Raphael Lemkin, a Jew from Lemberg, or today's Lviv in Ukraine, who had escaped from Hitler's Europe. So let's ask this question before we actually talk about what is the new social science of the Holocaust. I want to ask a different question, and that is, why is there no social science of the Holocaust? Or why has there been until now not much? Really, I think there are two big reasons. So the first, professional incentives. In political science and sociology, if you've ever wanted to make a big career within the discipline, you studied important things: democracy and dictatorship. Why are some countries democracies and others dictatorships? Or you studied why are some rich and some were poor. Those people who actually chose to study the Holocaust within social science. And the most important, of course, was Raoul Hilberg, who was known as a historian of the Holocaust, but he's actually a political scientist. He had trouble getting a job. Right? Nobody was really interested in this. The Holocaust was considered too narrow, too Jewish a topic. Scholars, they didn't want to be isolated professionally, so they sort of avoided it. And this is sort of strange because if you've ever been to an American Political Science Association or Sociology Association meeting, there's a lot of Jews there. They're just not studying Jewish topics for the most part. And it's sort of understandable why. But it really kind of inhibited the development of the application of social science methods to the Holocaust. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is the social sciences have evolved. They're often rooted in the present, right? How can the Holocaust be seen not just as history, but something as relevant now? Right? And as with each passing year, the Holocaust itself appeared to be more and more something of the past, to be sure, of interest to the Jewish people, right? But not an obvious kind of candidate for why we should be studying it now. It was mostly studied, as you probably won't be surprised, as by students of genocides. Now, thankfully, there are actually very few genocides, right? And that's a good thing. But from the standpoint of social science, we social scientists, we like to generalize. We like to know, okay, so why did genocides happen? Well, if you've only got 3 or 4 or 5, right, it becomes very difficult to kind of create a generalization of like from 3 or 4 or 5 cases, right? So people sort of stayed away from it. Now, historians actually were influenced by some social science. And here I wanted to point to the early studies in the 1960s by Stanley Milgram. Now, many of you out there will probably know about the Milgram experiments, right? They were designed to show that people would follow orders or inflict pain on others. They thought they were inflicting pain on others when directed by authorities, somebody in a lab coat saying, please, it is time now to inflict this pain on that person. Authorities, lab assistants, purely just wore a lab coat and said, if that person there is given a small shock or a larger shock, they'll be more likely to learn. Right? But when Milgram saw the Eichmann trial, Adolf Eichmann is one of the architects of the Holocaust. He tried to explain why so many Germans would have participated in the Holocaust, though in his own experiments, he doesn't really talk about it very much. It's really seen to be, right, from the standpoint of the United States. Now, the historian Christopher Browning, he drew on Milgram in order to show how ordinary German men who were actually middle-aged, too old to be fighting, were drafted into this Reserve Police Battalion 101. And what happened to them is they were basically drawn from one city, Hamburg, and they were drawn from across German society, right? There were some lawyers, doctors, garbage men from the professions, and they were put on a train, sent off to Poland in 1942-43, where they were told, and weren't told what they were going to do until they got there, and then were told the night before, look, tomorrow we're going to be killing all of these Jews. And not only did they do it, but they did it with a degree of enthusiasm, and they wrote home about it. They didn't resist. And this, Browning says that this is an illustration of Milgram's point that he made in these early experiments, that they were drawn in by the kind of small group that they were in to kind of, and to carry out these kind of inhumane orders. Right? So there is an early case of historians drawing on social science. But really, they ignored social science for the most part, and social scientists ignored the Holocaust. So the question is, what really changed? And I think there were a couple of things that changed. In the first place, the Berlin Wall fell. And what this did You see, what social scientists love, they love lots and lots of data. And what this opened up is the possibility for going into the archives in Eastern Europe. I myself went into the archives of Eastern Europe and wrote books that had nothing to do with the Holocaust. But I also then, in my later work and more recent work, went to the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw and used their thousands and thousands of testimonies that were given by Jews right after the war, before even the word Holocaust was even applied to what had happened. They didn't know what they were supposed to say. They hadn't seen Schindler's List. They hadn't been part of Holocaust education. And so these testimonies were incredibly fresh, incredibly authentic in many ways. And scholars also started to run around Eastern Europe and to ask people in these countries who may have witnessed the Holocaust, who may have seen, right, Jews being shot. So Father Dubois, most famously, went off to Ukraine and Belarus and documented what became known as the Holocaust by bullets, that is, Jews being shot near where they lived by the German military or by the SS or by local collaborators and then put into pits, right? So we started to learn an awful lot more and we could say a lot more. But other things started to change too. Um, since there were so few genocides, right, scholars started rethinking about what the nature of the Holocaust was. Rather than seeing the Holocaust as one big, gigantic event, right, which took place, let's say, between 1939 and 1945, across all of Europe, running from, France in the West to all the way to the Soviet Union in the East and, say, Greece or the Greek islands in the South, you could start to think of it differently. You can start to think of it as many events, right? So if you think about the Holocaust, so what happens is you think about, okay, in the first place, when the Nazis come to power, there's discrimination. So you could study that. You could study discrimination. Then there was ghettoization. You could study residential segregation, something we know about in the United States. Then in 1941, at the beginning of the war, there were pogroms where the Nazis basically let the locals do what they wanted to their Jewish neighbors. And you could study that in comparison to other types of intercommunal violence, let's say in comparison to lynching in the United States. Um, and then, of course, you had the mass killings, right, which took place over shooting pits, gas chambers, gas vans, and you could compare that with other types of mass killings. Um, and this allowed us to start looking at different types of violence. This was revolutionary. You could start asking questions, what are the conditions that lead to intercommunal violence? And that's really what got me interested in all of this, because I was a social scientist, but I was also, of course, very interested in Jews and Jewish studies. And I thought, there might be really interesting ways of applying the methods of social science in order to understand what actually occurred in the Holocaust with more precision. We can start to learn something new. We can bring our knowledge to the historians, and then, of course, we can bring the historians back to the social sciences. And that's what I started to do. So I wanted to give you a few examples, right? This is going to take me a few minutes, but I think you'll find this is sort of interesting. I wrote a book with Jason Wittenberg called Intimate Violence, and what we did is we studied a set of pogroms that occurred in 1941, in the summer of 1941. We had read a book by a sociologist who became a historian, by the way, Jan Gross, and he looked at one town in Poland called Jedwabne. And in early July 1941, as the Germans passed through very quickly, right, on their way to attacking the Soviet Union, um, in his words, half the town, the Poles, killed the other half the town. They basically frog marched the Jews, put them in a barn, and set the barn on fire. And we read that book, and Jason and I, we started thinking about, did this happen elsewhere? And it turned out it happened in many other places. And so we started looking at the weeks following the beginning of the Nazi war on the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. We looked at the villages and cities where locals violently attacked their Jewish neighbors. It was a very brief period, a 6-week period between June 22nd, 1941 and July 31st, 1941. And it happened in an incredibly broad set of territories, ranging from Lithuania in the north, all the way through the eastern Poland borderlands, Belarus, Ukraine, Romania. Um, but it didn't happen everywhere, right? And we used extant documents in order to document that it happened according to our research, in 219 locations. But of course, in eastern Poland alone, there are over 2,000 places where Jews lived in those eastern borderlands. So it only happened in about 10% of places. Now that's way too many, but that's where it happened. Um, and it only happened in those areas of the Soviet Union that joined after 1939. And some of you might know about the Hitler-Stalin Pact when Stalin takes over Eastern Europe. And then, of course, Hitler betrays Stalin and invades the Soviet Union. So it only happens in this one area for this one period of time. And we were very interested in why it happened. So here we actually happen to have photographs of these pogroms. This is Lvov, June 30th, 1941. And there's a Jewish man being attacked by a Ukrainian. We have very vivid pictures, in fact, sexually explicit pictures of these pogroms. There is, in fact, if you look on YouTube, you can find video of these pogroms. The Germans filmed it, but it was not the Germans who were doing it. Um, so that was Lviv, June 30th, 1941. 3 days earlier, in Lithuania, in Kovno, there was in a garage, a man carried a pipe wrench and beat dozens of Jews to death. And you can see here in the background, there are women looking on. The point of view of the photograph is actually from children. You can see there are children you can't see it in this photo, but there are children this was taken by a German army photographer. Afterwards, the man who did the beating took an accordion and played the national anthem on it. So there was a certain kind of festival, carnival-esque nature to this violence. So some observations. Based on a study of around 2,000 communities, we found that pogroms occurred in approximately 10% of those areas where they could have, that is, where Jews lived on the Eastern Front. And so our question was why did these pogroms occur where they did? That question asked that way, why do multicultural communities go bad, right? That could be of interest to people who aren't even interested in the Holocaust, because we know that intercommunal violence happens in other places, in different, Hindu-Muslim violence in India, of course, lynching in the United States. A third of all communities in the United States never had a lynching in the post-bellum South. And so the same types of dynamics might be interesting for people who are not interested in the Holocaust or Jewish studies. So what did we do? We first determined where pogroms occurred. We looked through these testimonies that I already talked about. And we asked, what made these places where pogroms, where the intercommunal violence happened, unique? And we started collecting data on each and every place in Eastern Poland. This took years. We looked at census data. Who lived there? Was it just Jews, or what combination of Jews, Poles, Belarusians, Lithuanians, who? What religion were they? We looked at socioeconomic data, that is, how literate were people? Were there small loan associations that were giving out loans just to Jews? We looked at voting data. There in this area of Poland that we're looking at, there were two very good elections in 1922 and 1928, right, where multiple parties ran. Nine Jewish parties, for example, lots of Polish parties. We looked at elections to see if the pre-existing political polarization was a factor, something that Americans in the United States, we should care about that today. We looked at to what extent how powerful was anti-Semitism. We looked at the performance of anti-Semitic parties. We found that it was important, but other areas where pogroms didn't occur were equally anti-Semitic. So this made it difficult to say that it was just anti-Semitism. We looked at communism. We looked at the strength of communist parties in the area. You had two good elections in which the communist parties could run for election. We didn't really see a gigantic impact there. And that sort of made this into a kind of an intellectual puzzle. So what were the causes? Well, of course, it's important to remember that each pogrom is unique, and I can talk during the Q&A if you want. I can talk to you. I have very explicit testimony about what happens during these pogroms. Well, was it the Germans? It doesn't really work. The Germans did encourage this behavior, but it happened in places, lots of places, where the Germans were either thinly on the ground or where they were not even present. That is, they passed through, or they hadn't even yet arrived. Was it the Soviet presence? Let's go back to the Germans for a second. I think if the Germans definitely encouraged this behavior, there were orders given by the SS saying, get the locals to do this. But there were lots of places where the locals were encouraged to do this, but refused to do this. And the Germans complained in their papers, in their reports, the SS reports. They complained they couldn't get the locals to do this. Well, what about the Soviet presence? They had just left. And in fact, when the Soviets left, just before they left, they had KGB, what at that time was called the NKVD, prisons that were filled with local Polish, Ukrainian nationalists, sometimes Zionists as well, too, sometimes Jewish nationalists. And just before they left, the Soviets massacred everybody. And you would think that of course, as soon as the Germans arrive in these places, they bring locals into these NKVD prisons and they say, you see what the Jews have done? And you would think that that had angered the locals, and that made the locals carry out these pogroms. But it doesn't quite work. And the reason it doesn't work is pogroms occurred where there were no NKVD prisons. It may have made the massacres worse where they did exist, where these prisons existed, but there's no indication that that alone caused them. So, as I said, the prisons were in areas where no pogroms occurred. They're not the only factor. And you can see from the pictures that I showed you, people were pulled from their homes. They were well dressed. Looting was important, but it didn't really determine where a pogrom did. What did we find? Well, it won't surprise you that pogroms occurred that I, as a political scientist, found, and Jason and I both found, that pogroms occurred where there were pre-existing political divides. That is, where the Jews and locals had voted for the same political parties, right? And they didn't have to be socialist parties. They could be any of the same political parties. There were no pogroms. And we found that sort of shocking. And then we found something even more shocking. The pogroms were much more likely to occur where Jews voted either for Zionist or Bundist parties. That is, where Jews had their own political parties. Now, there were many Jewish political parties. It won't surprise you to know the Jews didn't always agree among themselves. And where they voted for Zionist parties, they were especially subject to massacre. Now, why is that the case? It's not because the Jews intended necessarily to move to Israel. You couldn't move to Israel at this time for the simple reason is that there was no Israel, number one, and there were also restrictions on Jewish immigration there. What Zionism really meant at this time in Poland. Nobody spoke Hebrew, for example. Some people could understand Hebrew, but very few people could speak it. What Zionism meant at this time in Poland was a very assertive expression of Jewish identity. To vote Zionist meant you were going to be Jewish and you were not going to join the Polish nation building project. You wanted Jewish communal rights. The Jews wanted education in Jewish languages, mostly Yiddish, but also Hebrew. And they wanted Jewish representation in public. And in those places where the Jews expressed themselves in this way, that sent a signal to the locals, whether it be Polish or Ukrainian, that they were not going to join the local nation building project. And when the Germans came through, they said to the locals, do whatever you want. And in those places where the Jews had signaled where they were not going to join the local nation building project, the locals used what was going to be their only opportunity to rid themselves of future rivals. And they did so by massacring them and putting them in their place. Okay, so that's the finding from the Pogroms book. And here is an important finding because you can learn a lot by studying the kind of in a kind of a micro granular way about what were the causes of locals not helping Jews, but in fact turning against them. So I want to give you a second example. This is a study by, and I'm going to turn completely away from pogroms now. I'm going to turn to a study by Volha Charnish and Yevgeny Finkel. Charnish is at MIT, and Finkel is at Johns Hopkins. And I've put up a map here, and it's a little blurry, so just let me tell you about it for a second. In the center of that map is a dot, a red dot. That is the death camp, Treblinka. You'll notice where Treblinka is located. In the northeast, there's a city, which you maybe can make out, it's blurry, I'm sorry about this map, of Białystok. And south and west of there is Warsaw. And Treblinka is placed almost halfway in between. And what you can see there, this is in Poland, and you can see the borders there are the county borders. And this map shows a set of sort of concentric circles, and that becomes important for what I'm going to tell you in a minute. A set of concentric circles around the camp, right? Farther and farther away from the camp. Just stay with me for a minute. And this is actually very important within their study. The important thing about this is Treblinka is placed there, right, for no apparent reason other than it is halfway and it is close to a rail spur. What is Treblinka? It is a death camp. Nearly 1 million Jews were murdered there. It was set up in 1942 as part of what was called Operation Reinhardt, right? Named after Reinhard Heydrich, who had one of the number 3 Nazi, who had been killed earlier in Czechoslovakia by partisans. Charnish and Finkel studied the long-term political and economic behavior in the areas surrounding Treblinka. That is, what happens after the war. Why do they study this? Well, what they determined, and others have determined, is that the property and belongings of murdered Jews ended up in the hands of locals. That is, guards took this property, gold, furs, clothing, shoes, eyeglasses, and traded them with local Poles in the communities around the camp. They traded them for what? For goods, for prostitution, for alcohol. And what they discovered, what Charnish and Finkel discovered, is that locals near the Treblinka death camp benefited economically from the dead Jews even decades after the war. Now, how did they get at this? That's the circle. So they drew circles around the camp. So here you have these concentric circles, which are basically in kind of 5, 10, 15, 20 kilometers away from the camp. And what they found is that the closer you were to the camp, the more likely you were to have, as an inhabitant of that area, A house, they looked at the roofs of the houses near the camp in the year 1970. That's 25 years after the Holocaust. And they found you were much more likely to have a metal roof on your house close to the camp than if you lived farther away. Now, you might say, didn't they already have metal roofs before? The answer is no. They have data on that. It is not other factors. What happened is these locals, of course, Poland becomes communist after the war. You couldn't actually, buy trips to Miami Beach or television sets or cars. So what they did is they invested in their local real estate. In effect, you got a real estate boom in these areas close to the camp. Um, and they found this had profound impact on local socioeconomic life decades after the Holocaust, right? They also learned that it had profound effects on current behavior and politics into the 1990s. They found that surrounding the communities had a much higher propensity, communities that were closer to the camp, who had benefited from the camp, who were much more likely to vote for anti-Semitic parties. Why? Well, they've offered two reasons. One is they worried about restitution, right? That Jews might demand restitution, and they were much more likely to have benefited from this. And because they sort of felt guilty, that they knew, and their children knew, that they felt guilty, they felt that they had benefited from the Holocaust. Their results showed that living near the death camp and benefiting from Jewish property made locals much more likely to support an anti-Semitic party into the 1990s. Another remarkable finding, which you could only have gotten by studying it in a way that a social scientist can. I want to point to a last example. A sociologist at UC Berkeley. He's done some fascinating work on the Netherlands. And he's really interested in the question of why do local communities, you might know that the Netherlands had a Jewish community, not a large one, but a significant one, and it was wiped out at a very high level. And he was very interested in why did some local communities protect Jews during the Holocaust and why some didn't. And he really did some very heavy lifting. He found records of 93% of Jews who lived in the Netherlands during the war. He looked at which ones were assisted by local churches. On a map, he geocoded, that is, he placed every Jew in the Netherlands at their address at which they lived and found which churches were the closest. And he found this was important for understanding which Jews received assistance. Now, you probably know, or you may not, the Netherlands had historically, and still is, divided between Protestants and Catholics. And what he found, and this is fascinating, the Jews were much more likely to receive assistance from Protestants in predominantly Catholic areas and from Catholics in predominantly Protestant areas. That is, essentially, religious minorities in communities were better able and willing to help out Jews as fellow minorities. Now, the reason this is important is because it shows it has nothing to do with Protestant theology or Protestant social teachings or Catholic theology or Catholic social teachings. Rather, it has to do with the experience of being a minority and the resources that gave you, right, in order to help out others, and the willingness that it gave you to help out others. And Brown, this book, he wrote a book on this. It won multiple awards. It's a fantastic piece of research. Again, what you could have only learned by doing this very painstaking reconstruction of the details to looking at what are the conditions under which people help out others who are in difficulty and distress, something we in the United States might soon be thinking about more. Of course, this was Amsterdam, picture of Amsterdam. I thought I'd throw that up there. And so this issue of minority groups and empathy, right, he finds to be extremely important. Minority groups were much more likely to have networks of trust, to be tightly knit, right? So Protestants in Catholic areas, Catholics in Protestant areas, and also empathy. They understood what it meant to be a minority, a persecuted minority, or a minority at least kind of experienced kind of second-class citizenship. So rescue was not about any particular religion or motivation. It was more a product of the local environment. And Brown offers a new methodology for thinking about rescue. So let me sort of conclude here, right? Social science and Holocaust research. I think it's only going to become bigger and bigger into the future. We have much better methods. We haven't even started to apply the methods of artificial intelligence yet to all of this. We can look at a level of granularity to address puzzles, right, that were long thought to be solved, but now we know perhaps weren't. We can apply modern social science to historical puzzles. Think about Kristallnacht. There were many, many communities in Germany, right? Those of you know what Kristallnacht is. On November 9th, 1938, there was a pogrom that was across Germany that was kind of unleashed by the Nazi leadership. And in most communities, large communities in Germany, synagogues were destroyed, Jewish homes, Jewish property was destroyed. But not all. And we can start to study what insulated those places where where Jewish synagogues were not burned, were not attacked, right? We don't know enough about that yet. That's something that could be studied. In short, I want to jump to the end here about this is really opens up the possibility, which I think is very important for a younger generation, of integrating Holocaust studies into the mainstream of the social sciences. I think one of the challenges in the years ahead is to be keeping the Holocaust relevant for broader and broader groups of people, not just older people who are naturally interested in the Holocaust, Jews who are interested in the Holocaust, but also, generations of non-Jews and the younger people, and especially people who don't know why they should be studying the Holocaust. I think this will actually give them a reason for doing so, because we can actually make what is arguably the index case of violence in the modern world relevant to broader and broader groups of people. And with that, I wanted to thank you for your attention, and I wanted to stop there and take questions.
Okay, yes, I'm back now. Thank you so much for an incredibly interesting and fascinating presentation. Before I bring up some questions, I'm a historian, and what you tackled, first of all, it's very impressive, studying 2,000 communities where pogroms occurred, and it's absolutely fascinating. So I'm very appreciative of this different look. Okay, so we have some questions. Here's one. Have you considered the multiple crusades in which death was religiously sanctioned, but had an initial task of liberating Jerusalem by taking it from the Islamists or Muslims, but was used to affirm the killing of all Jews and Muslims as well on the way?
Um, in fact, many of the same factors I've written about this a little bit in other places, not so much within the book. So in the book, Intimate Violence, at the last chapter of the book, we take what we found for the Holocaust and we apply it to other places. We look at lynching in the American South, and there we found, lo and behold, actually the political constellations affected which places had lynchings and which did not. We look at Hindu-Muslim violence in India, and there's a very kind of clear electoral connection. But even if you go back in Jewish history, when was the first pogrom? I bet most of the people here don't know that. The first pogrom, actually the first historically documented pogrom, you could say the first pogrom is actually in the Book of Esther, but the historicity of that is questioned. But what's not questioned is Alexandria 38 CE, which was documented by a Jewish philosopher, Philo, who went off to then go see Caligula to try and stop it from happening again. And there, Philo has a very interesting set of observations on the preconditions that actually allowed for this pogrom to break out. And that was the question of, would the Jews be given full citizenship, right? Whose city was it? Now, of course, they didn't have voting, right? So we couldn't look at things that way. But in fact, afterwards, Caligula's successor, Claudius, writes a letter to the locals and the Jews saying, locals, quit beating up the Jews. And you Jews, you're living peacefully in this city. Do not claim more than you should in a city that is not your own. That's a quote, right? And so there you have many of the same types of things. Now, of course, that carries over into the Middle Ages. The Jews in the Middle Ages, and that was the question that was brought up. The Jews in the Middle Ages were seen as the king's treasure, right? That is, they provided through the collection of loans, interest, taxation, and they had to pay taxation, which were tied very closely to the interest rates that they were allowed to charge. They had to pay taxes to the king, and the king got money that way. And when locals didn't want to pay interest or taxes anymore, they would blame the Jews. The Jews were, in essence, the Jews were seen as the kind of the paw of the monarch. And so you had these same types of kind of political determinants of where you get anti-Jewish violence and where you don't. Of course, it's not exactly the same. When I talk about the interwar determinants of violence against Jews that occurred during the Holocaust, right? Of course, this is the era of mass electoral politics before then, which makes it different. But I think there are certain similarities.
Somebody else is asking, can you apply your insights to more recent genocides, like the Rwanda genocide? I would imagine you can, right?
Yeah. So, the Rwanda genocide, there's been people who've tried this, especially broader intercommunal violence within Africa. And there are really it's interesting. I didn't give you the real theory that we drew from in order to study these pogroms came from racial politics in the United States, right? And the argument there is that where you have more of a racial group and where that group is mobilized into its own politics that threatens the dominance of the majority, you'll be more likely to get violence against the minority. There have been people who've looked at Rwanda who've tried to establish, and of course, Rwanda did not have that same kind of electoral politics, but you did have, right, places where Hutus and Tutsis, the two dominant, there's also the Twa, which are a much smaller group, the Hutus and Tutsis within Rwanda had different proportions. So the way you could study it, I haven't studied it, but the way you could study it is to look at places that did and did not have massacres and to see if the ethnic balance between Hutus and Tutsis was different in those kinds of places. So it's really a question of kind of ethnic balance. And even when you don't have democratic politics, what democratic politics does in multi-ethnic societies is it translates demographic weight very efficiently into political power, right? That's what democracies do, right? And so you could study it in a case like Rwanda by saying if they did have democratic politics, this is the danger that it would produce, right? So, and that the kind of felt threat. And so it won't surprise you to know that the theory that we're using in the Pogroms book is sometimes called power threat theory, right? Because the idea is that the threat of the minority grabbing power, right? And so you could start to look at that. You could also start to look at in cases of multi-ethnic societies where you get violence, if you could take Charnish's and Finkel's study at places where you have the acquisition of property as a result of violence, and then the decades-long consequences of that acquisition of property. Think of what happens in the American frontier, right? Or in other places, and you can think of your favorite places that have had ethnic violence. We know at the beginning of Israel in 1948, right? There was a war, right? And there was population movements. And I'm not going to get into, I know there is questions here that want me to get into that, and I'm happy to do it. But I mean, there were movements of both Jews in and out of territories and Arabs in and out of territories. And there were acquisitions of property you could start to study, did those acquisitions of property, both by Arabs and Jews, did that have long-term consequences on their political behavior, right? Or exposure to violence, right? Long-term consequences for political behavior. It's exactly the same kinds of things that social scientists have studied.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Somebody asked a question that I also was mulling over as you were talking. Do you think part of the motive behind anti-Semitism was that the locals wanted their stuff and were envious of Jewish success? I was actually kind of thinking of this. You said that, with that little map where Treblinka was at the center, Bialystok to the
Northeast.
northeast, yes, and Warsaw to the southwest.
Right.
And the closer they were to Treblinka, the neighbors, the more likely they were to actually support the genocide. I guess I put it that way.
Or profit from
Yeah,
it.
because of a profit from it, right? So that actually made me think of a book that you probably are familiar with, American history book by Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning. And it's essentially a history of racism in the United States for the last 400 years. And he basically says that what comes first is the practices, actions, whether it is oppressing somebody or benefiting from them. And then comes the justification. Then comes well, in the American case, it's racism. In this case, it might be supporting anti-Semitic parties. So to get back to the question asked by our guests, how does anti-Semitism actually fit into this?
Yeah. Well, anti-Semitism, look, anti-Semitism is a precondition, right? If everybody loved Jews, there'd never be pogroms, there'd never be anti-Jewish violence.
Right.
Clearly, let's just state that up front. But
Mhm.
my point is that actually, it's not that there wasn't anti-Semitism. It's just that anti-Semitism was too evenly spread across Polish community. It was
Right,
everywhere. It so
Mhm.
can't distinguish between the minority of places that did have this anti-Jewish violence than did not. One of the best ways of answering your question is by actually, let me talk about an actual pogrom, right? Give you an example, right? There's a small city, right, called Szczecin, right, which is in northeastern Poland near the Lithuanian border. On June 25th, 1941, 3 days after the war begins, the Germans roll through very quickly. They put up a flag and they have a field troop outside of the city and they push on eastward. They're trying to get to Moscow. They tell the locals, do whatever you want. The locals, um, a group of local Poles gets together and starts to massacre Jews in the most brutal manner. And we have testimonies of this. And the most moving letter is by a woman named Chaya Soika Golding, right, who survived the war and wrote a letter to her relatives after the war and said, look, they were pretty well organized, the locals. They hated Jews, at least those who were carrying these pogroms. There you have anti-Semitism. They started going through the streets, right, with wagons, taking Jewish stuff. There's your point about looting, right? Going through apartments. That's my apartment. That's going to be my silverware. That is going to be my clothing. But they weren't happy just with that. They started massacring the Jews with very vivid descriptions of women nursing their children at breast. I mean, really terrible, terrible kinds of things. And then what happens next? Evening comes, right? And the locals stop, and a few locals say this is going to happen for another couple of days. The men had sort of disappeared because the Germans were looking for them, but these were local Poles. The Haya Soika Golding and the other Jewish women started panicking. They run to the priest, and the local Catholic priest says, look, can you stop this? He goes, look, I can't, right? You guys are godless communists, and you're responsible for everything that's bad that's happened to us. They go to the local intelligentsia. They go to lawyers, doctors. No salvation. And then something very strange happens. She writes this. She says, we decided to try our hands with the Germans. So they went to the Germans who were just outside of the town, had set up a local field troop. And they said to the Germans, can you stop this? The German soldiers said, look, we're just soldiers. We're not getting involved in your local affairs, right? And then she says, we asked them again, And then we gave them soap and coffee, and that softened them up. And in that way, the Germans put an end to the pogrom. And that's the way the narrative ends. Now, this is the third day of the war. The Germans had soap and coffee on day number 3. It took me many years to think about this, to realize that this was not soap and coffee. Right? And in fact, another Jewish female testimony from that same town says, and then we and the most beautiful daughters of the Jewish community went to work for the Germans. And in that way, the pogrom came to an end. And so why am I telling you all of this? Because this really illustrates the complexity of a pogrom environment. You have all of it at work. You have hatred, anti-Semitism, you have greed, you have the desire for Jewish stuff, you have pure sexual depravity, right? You have indifference, you have abdication of responsibility. Nobody comes off very well in all of this, right?
Right.
But it also happens to have been a place where the Jews were highly organized into their own Zionist groups before the war, right? I'm not blaming the Jews at all, but the Jews were despised. But they were definitely despised in that town, and nobody was willing to help them. Right now, there were other places where I could tell the opposite story, where the locals may not have liked the Jews, but they were willing to help. Right, and that's a different.
And they probably were still anti-Semitic, right?
Because it's one thing to be anti-Semitic; it's another thing to carry out massacres.
Right.
That's very different kinds of things. Yes.
Right. We have a really good question here that I think it's a lot on the minds of many academics. Would you like to take a shot at lessons for how Jewish faculty should address the current dilemma? And here comes the question, or the broader commentary. Many of us think that the federal government is using anti-Semitism on campus as a cudgel to attack universities, yet we also recognize that universities could do a much better job of protecting Jews. Would you like to comment?
It's not really on what I talked about. Of course, I have an opinion on this. Every faculty member said, yes, I'd agree with both of those things, that the Jews definitely, I did a survey on this on 4 University of California campuses last year. There was an uptick in anti-Semitism after October 7th. There's no doubt about it, right? It's there. You can read them. I just put my name into a search engine and put Anti-Defamation League. I published it with the Anti-Defamation League. It shows that. Right, quite conclusively. That said, what's happening now is a kind of weaponization of anti-Semitism against the university by people I don't think really care very much about anti-Semitism. That's my own view, and I've been teaching for 35 years. I sort of know universities very well. I've been the director of several centers for Jewish studies. I know Jewish life on campus very well. My life was made sort of not that great last year. But what's going on now to the universities really has nothing to do with addressing anti-Semitism. That's my view.
Thank you for sharing that. And now back to your research. And by the way, you get, I don't know if you see them yourself or you can read them afterwards. You're getting a lot of very positive comments. But there was somebody, I'm trying to find it, maybe it was deleted. There was somebody who asked what questions still need to be asked and where else should the research go? And I know you already touched on a few things. And the final question of this subset of questions was, how could AI be used going forward?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So there, I'm going to give you 2 examples just recently. So political scientists are doing this, and it's not even Jews. It's really, I think that's the sign of a healthy discipline when it's not just the ethnics of that group who are studying the thing, right? So you have now the most recent American Political Science Review had 2 articles about the Holocaust. Totally interesting. Actually, not about the Holocaust per se, but one was exactly on that. So there has been a recent study on the effect of having witnessed trains with Jews on them near you going by, right? And that gets at this issue of cognitive dissonance. Does this make you feel lousy? And then you want to say, look, I didn't know anything about it. The Jews are making too much of it, that kind of thing, right? There's that. There's a recent article studying whether right or left-wing resistance within France was much more likely or less likely to help Jews. And that they have data that a woman, she's French, all the way down to the village level. I peer-reviewed that article for the journal. It's an excellent, a very interesting article. You could take the same data that I looked at, that I used, the census data for Poland. And because we have data on, did Jews declare themselves to be Jewish by religion or Jewish by nationality and language? And you have a large number of Jews who declare themselves increasingly over time to be declared to be Jewish by religion, but Polish by nationality. And we haven't studied it yet, but I've seen this in my own data. You could look at that as a measurement of willingness to assimilate in an American kind of way, the way I think like I'm American, but I'm also Jewish, right? And was there a kind of a movement afoot in Poland for Jewish acculturation that was attenuated by the Holocaust, right? That which would make it an even greater tragedy in some ways,
Right.
because the
Yeah.
Jews were, you could say, well, okay, they faced all kinds of discrimination, as they did in the United States too in the 1950s. You just watch the movie Gentleman's Agreement to know, right? What were the Jews sort of on their way to some sort of acculturation? Some Jews say no, some Jews say yes, but you could actually study that in a much more, precise way with a degree of precision that I think, the question deserves. So those are the kinds of things you could do that haven't been done. As for AI, I've goofed around with it myself, right? Because it just really started, right? And of course, it produces some stuff. So what I've done is one time I said, so I've written several articles comparing pogroms in antiquity to the medieval world. So I have Alexandria 38 CE, Valencia 1391. There were pogroms all over Spain in 1391. 100 years before the Inquisition in 1941. And so I've told AI, generate for me a comparison of these, right? So I've compared them myself, and I want to see if AI finds dimensions of comparison that I hadn't thought of. Were there commonalities or differences? And I was only semi-satisfied with it, right? Because, part of the problem is drawing on my own research in order to generate,
Yes.
because I'm part of the database, right? But it sees things, the idea here is that it could see things that we don't see, right? With a level of granularity, especially once you start feeding in all of this data to it, right? These kinds of statistical analyses that I did, right? That you can do them much more easily now than you ever could before, right? It's just, the kind of heavy lifting that Wittenberg and I did for the Pogroms book, it's not clear that you need to do that heavy lifting anymore, right? And remember, our book is 2018. That's how fast things are moving.
Right. Yeah, I think I would like to ask one final question. You have given us already so much to think about. How would you apply your insights on not anti-Semitic, on interethnic, intimate violence, or the prospect of this violence to the case of the United States?
Yeah,
Because I think a lot of us are very concerned.
yeah. Well, I think one of the lessons, one of the primary obvious lessons of our book is that, look, under the right circumstances, political polarization can produce very deadly outcomes, right? Now, Poland, Eastern Poland, Western Ukraine, 1941, first of all, the Germans had invaded, state authority had completely collapsed, right? The locals said, locals were told, do whatever you want. They were sort of facilitated. They were given license to do all of this, right? While we have extreme political polarization in the United States, right? I think about polarization in the United States, like people don't, people in the United States have sorted by neighborhood, by car, right? You can actually tell somebody how they're going to vote based on what car they drive, with the food they eat, right? So we sort, but we don't have the complete collapse of state authority. But I thought one time, right, think about Charlottesville, 2017, the Unite the Right rally. What if that had not been a kind of liberal university town with the police, the cops all around, the police present, right? What if that had been someplace in the Deep South where it wasn't a university town, where the town was divided along racial lines? And the police just were hands off, like my Germans in Chuchin in 1941, saying it's not our business. We're just not going to do anything about it. I worry that under those kinds of conditions, if state authority collapses, hence my most recent book, The Assault on the State, if state authority collapses, you can get all kinds of things happen. People can act on their worst impulses under those kinds of conditions. And I worry about that in the case of the United States. I do. I mean, who couldn't? And it's not a matter of kind of right-left distinction, Republican versus Democrat at this point. I worry that we're so polarized, right? That under the right conditions, in the right kinds of communities, with the right kinds of demography, where all the arrows are pointing in the same direction, that you could get some kind of horrible thing that none of us could have ever expected.
Are there any countervailing forces?
Yes.
Anything that gives you?
Yes.
I would like to end on a
Yes.
moderate.
Well, let me tell you two things. Remember, pogroms don't happen in most places. Which tells you they're very easy
Right.
to prevent. And the Germans complain about this. We tried to get the locals to do it and they wouldn't. So where do they not happen? Right? They don't happen where the locals and the Jews vote for the same political parties, right? Even like, whether they be communists, right? Because of course, communists were not authoritarian. We're not democratic. They were authoritarian, clearly. But it was one of those places where Jews and non-Jews could sort of get along. But also, if they voted for the kind of would-be dictator, a guy named Pilsudski, Joseph Pilsudski, who was he was an authoritarian, but he was not an anti-Semite. Right. He famously had a Jewish mistress. And when he died, the head rabbis of Poland went to his funeral. And so this is the kind of, when they voted for him, there also were no pogroms. Right. And so what that tells me, it doesn't take a lot to prevent the worst. You don't have to love each other. Right. Love is a little bit too much. Right. You have to have the basic kind of basic solidarity that as much as we may disagree, we're sort of in this together. We face common problems, and we know in this country we face daunting problems, right? But we're sort of all in it together, and the attempts to sort of divide us, to sort us along partisan lines are the true poison that I hope that one day can be sort of drained from the American body politic.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing all your insights, your very important insights. Thank you also for all of you who joined us. I would like to announce the next event. On April 24th, we will host history professor Ari Joskovich. Professor Joskovich will give a talk about his latest book, Reign of Ash, Roma, Jews, and the Holocaust. In my view, this study of the complex relationship between two unequal victim groups is among the most innovative and important research on the Holocaust, historically speaking, in recent years. The workshop will take place in the UC San Diego Library, the Geisel Library, and it will be preceded by a reception. But for those who are unable to join us in person, we will live stream it. So I hope I will see you there. Thank you again, Jeff, for a really insightful talk. Have a good night, everybody.
Take care.